Imagine a hollow, shrouded in fog, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the wind carries whispers of forgotten sins. You've just pulled off a crumbling road in West Virginia, tires crunching over gravel, when you spot it, an isolated cluster of shacks, windows like empty eyes staring back. Inside, shadows move, figures twisted by time and blood. Among them, a child no more than 12, her belly swollen with a secret that binds the family tighter than chains. This is no ghost story. It is real, etched into the genealogy of the Whitaker family, America's most haunted bloodline. A legacy of inbreeding so profound it warps minds and bodies, hiding truths that society buried long ago. Dare to look closer, and you'll see the darkness lurking in the roots of our nation's hidden history. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In West Virginia's shadowed valleys, where coal mines scar the earth like old wounds, the Whitaker family story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet union of blood that should never have mixed. It all traces back to the late 19th century, when into a world of hardship and isolation, identical twin brothers Henry and John Whitaker were born. These men, mirror images of each other, grew up in the rural backwoods where survival meant clinging to family, sometimes too closely. Henry married a local woman named Sally, and together they raised a son named John Emery. Meanwhile, his twin John wed a woman, and they brought forth a daughter, Gracie Irene. In any other tale, this might have been the end of it, simple branches on a family tree. But fate, or perhaps desperation, twisted their paths. The twins' children, John Emery and Gracie, were double first cousins, sharing not just blood, but an eerie genetic echo from their identical fathers. In 1937, they married, sealing a bond that blurred the lines between love and taboo. Their union produced 15 children, each one a living testament to the perils of inbreeding. The first, Eileen, arrived healthy enough, but as the brood grew, the shadows lengthened. Emery Lee, their second, gasped his last breath from pneumonia just a month after birth, a fragile life snuffed out too soon. Then came Freddie, who would later succumb to a long illness, his body ravaged by unseen defects. Laureen, one of the daughters, gave birth to Timmy in 1979, a boy whose mind would forever wander in simplicity. But whispers in the hollows spoke of darker currents beneath the surface. Isolation bred not just genetic frailties, but secrets that festered like untreated wounds. The family huddled in Odd, a village aptly named, where outsiders were rare and suspicions ran deep. John and Gracie's home became a fortress of silence, where the children's eyes held stories they couldn't voice. And amid this tangled web, allegations surfaced, hints of violations within the bloodline, where youth was stolen in the name of continuity. Buried in court records and hushed testimonies, one account points to a girl scarcely into her teens, bearing the burden of a pregnancy that shocked even the most jaded investigators. She was 12, they say, when the cycle repeated itself, a child forced into motherhood by the very ties that should have protected her. This was no mere rumor. It echoed through the convictions of later generations, where grandsons like John Wade Jr. and Jason faced justice for assaults on the innocent, preying on girls as young as 13. The Whitaker bloodline, once a simple thread, had knotted into something monstrous. Genetic mutations manifested in fused eyelids, cleft palates, and minds trapped in eternal childhood. Ray, one of the brothers, communicates only in grunts and barks, his face a map of unspoken pain. Betty, the matriarch now, vowed never to marry, dedicating her life to shielding her siblings from the world's gaze. Yet the past clings like mountain mist, refusing to dissipate. In Odd, time moves differently, cycles of birth and decay repeating. Each generation pays the price for ancestors' choices. As historians sift through faded documents, they uncover a pattern, poverty driving families inward, where marriage outside the clan meant risking the unknown. But for the Whitakers, the cost was higher, lives stunted, potentials crushed under the weight of inherited flaws. Peeling back these layers reveals not just a family, but a microcosm of America's forgotten underbelly. The Appalachians hold many such tales, but none as viscerally unsettling as this. What drove Henry and John to let their bloodlines entwine so fatally? Was it ignorance or a deeper, primal urge to preserve purity at any cost? The answers lie buried in unmarked graves and sealed records, waiting for those brave enough to dig. And as we delve deeper, remember, this isn't ancient history. The Whitakers live on, their story a living cautionary tale echoing through the hills like a warning from the past. The Whitaker family story doesn't end with John and Gracie's generation. It spirals further into the shadows, each child a new chapter in a book no one dared to read aloud. By the 1960s, their home in Odd, West Virginia, was more than a dwelling. It was a crucible where isolation and inbreeding forged lives marked by struggle and secrecy. The children, 15 in total, grew up in a world apart, where the outside was a distant rumor and family was everything. But this closeness came at a cost. Medical records, scarce and often incomplete, hint at congenital issues that plagued the brood. Heart defects, skeletal anomalies, and intellectual disabilities wove through their lineage like threads in a cursed tapestry. Betty, the eldest surviving daughter, became the family's anchor, her fierce loyalty a shield against prying eyes. Yet even she couldn't protect them from the whispers of what happened behind closed doors. Among the siblings, Laureen stood out, not for her strength, but for her tragedy. At 18, she gave birth to Timmy, a boy whose developmental delays were evident early on. Whispers in Odd suggested his father was no stranger to the family, a claim that carried the weight of taboo. Laureen's life, like her mother's before her, was shaped by the expectations of a clan that turned inward to survive. But survival meant sacrifice. The children grew up in a haze of poverty, their world limited to the hollows and the creaking walls of their shacks. Education was a luxury replaced by the daily grind of existence. Some, like Ray and Larry, bore physical marks of their heritage, faces that seemed to carry the weight of generations, eyes that saw too much yet understood too little. The community around them played a role in this seclusion. Odd was a place where secrets were currency, and the Whitakers were both pitted and feared. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the family, about children born too young, about pregnancies that raised questions no one dared answer. Court documents from the 1980s reveal a disturbing pattern, allegations of incest and abuse not just within the Whitaker home, but radiating outward. One case involved a granddaughter, barely a teenager, whose pregnancy sent shockwaves through the county. The father, a relative, was convicted, but the damage was done. A child raising a child, her future stolen before it began. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a cycle that thrived in isolation, where shame silenced truth. What makes this tale so chilling is its persistence. The Whitakers didn't vanish into history. They endured, their bloodline a living paradox of resilience and ruin. Geneticists who've studied such cases point to inbreeding's brutal arithmetic. Each generation doubles the risk of recessive disorders, amplifying flaws until they scream through flesh and bone. For the Whitakers, this meant children who could barely speak, siblings whose lives were tethered to a family that both loved and destroyed them. The hills of West Virginia, with their beauty and brutality, became a prison of circumstance. And yet the family pressed on, their story a dark mirror reflecting America's hidden corners, places where poverty and pride conspire to bury the truth. As we peel back another layer, the question lingers, how deep does this darkness run? And what does it say about the nation that let it fester? By the 1980s, the Whitaker family saga had become a living ghost story, one that locals in Odd, West Virginia, whispered about but rarely confronted. The family's shacks, clustered like gravestones in the hollow, stood as silent witnesses to decades of intertwined bloodlines. The children of John and Gracie, now adults, carried the scars of their heritage, some in their bodies, others in their minds. Ray, with his grunts and wild gestures, seemed to embody the family's unspoken pain, his voice trapped in a place words couldn't reach. Lorraine, another sibling, bore the weight of her own tragedies, her eyes reflecting a life of quiet endurance. The family's isolation wasn't just physical. It was a wall built from shame, poverty, and a stubborn refusal to let the outside world in. But the outside world was beginning to notice. Social workers and county officials, drawn by rumors of neglect and abuse, started circling closer. Reports from the era, buried in dusty archives, describe a household where chaos reigned. Children born to the Whittaker daughters often stayed within the clan, raised in a haze of confusion about who was parent, sibling, or cousin. One case, documented in a 1984 court filing, tells of a girl barely 12, pregnant by a relative, her name redacted to shield her from a world that had already failed her. The father, a Whittaker cousin, faced charges, but convictions did little to unravel the family's knotted ties. These weren't anomalies. They were patterns woven into the fabric of a bloodline that had turned inward for too long. The genetic toll was undeniable. Doctors who examined the family noted conditions like microcephaly and severe developmental delays, traits that appeared with chilling frequency. Each child born to the Whittakers carried a higher risk of inheriting recessive disorders, their DNA a ticking time bomb of ancestral choices. Yet the family's loyalty to one another was fierce, almost primal. Betty, now the de facto matriarch, guarded her siblings like a sentinel, deflecting questions from outsiders with a steely gaze. She knew the world saw them as freaks, a curiosity to be gawked at, but to her, they were family, flawed, broken, but hers. This loyalty, though, couldn't shield them from the truth. Their bloodline was a labyrinth with no exit. What's most haunting is how this story mirrors America's hidden fractures. The Whittakers weren't just a family. They were a symptom of a nation that often ignores its most vulnerable. Rural poverty, lack of education, and systemic neglect created the conditions for this tragedy to unfold. The hills of West Virginia, with their beauty and desolation, became a crucible where the worst of human instincts could fester unchecked. As we dig deeper, the question isn't just about the Whittakers. It's about what their story reveals about the shadows we all inherit, the ones we pretend don't exist. By the 1990s, the Whittaker family story had taken on a mythic quality in Odd, West Virginia, a tale told in hushed tones around campfires and in barrooms. The family's shacks, weathered by time and neglect, stood as relics of a past that refused to stay buried. The surviving siblings, Betty, Lorraine, Ray, and others, lived in a world that had grown smaller, tighter, as if the hills themselves were closing in. Their lives were a paradox, bound by love, yet fractured by the consequences of their bloodline. The outside world, now more connected than ever, began to cast a harsher light on their existence. Documentarians and curious journalists ventured into the hollow, drawn by rumors of a family unlike any other, their cameras capturing faces that told stories of both resilience and ruin. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Whittaker children, now adults, were a living gallery of inbreeding's toll. Timmy, Laureen's son, moved through life with a childlike simplicity, his speech halting and his understanding limited. Ray, unable to form words, communicated through guttural sounds, his eyes wild with emotions he couldn't express. Medical evaluations, though rare, painted a grim picture: congenital heart issues, skeletal deformities, and cognitive impairments that left some siblings dependent on Betty's care. The family's isolation had preserved them in a way, but it also trapped them in a cycle of dependency and dysfunction. Social services, underfunded and overwhelmed, made sporadic visits, but interventions were fleeting. The Whittakers were too entrenched, their way of life too deeply rooted to be easily untangled. What chilled investigators most was the persistence of the family's darker secrets. Court records from the decade reveal more allegations of abuse, with names like John Wade Jr. and Jason Whittaker appearing in charges of sexual assault against minors. One case, buried in a 1992 docket, described a girl just 13, pregnant by a family member, her identity shielded but her trauma laid bare in clinical prose. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the inevitable fruit of a bloodline that had collapsed inward, where boundaries of kinship blurred into something grotesque. The community, complicit in its silence, turned away, leaving the Whittakers to their fate. Yet there was humanity here, too, in the way Betty held her family together, in the fleeting moments of laughter captured by outsiders' lenses. The Whitakers weren't monsters. They were people caught in a web spun by poverty, ignorance, and a history that offered no escape. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's margins, places where help rarely reaches, where cycles of trauma perpetuate themselves in silence. As we peel back this layer, the question isn't just about the Whitakers' sins. It's about the society that let them fester, watching from a distance as a family drowned in its own blood. As the new millennium dawned, the Whitaker family's story began to spill beyond the confines of odd, West Virginia, carried by the internet's unblinking eye. Their shacks, now crumbling under the weight of decades, became a grim pilgrimage site for those drawn to the macabre. YouTube videos and amateur documentaries spread their tale, framing them as both victims and curiosities. Betty, now in her later years, remained the family's stoic guardian, her weathered face a mask hiding a lifetime of burdens. Her siblings, Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and others, lived in a world that felt frozen in time, their daily routines unchanged even as the world's gaze sharpened. The Whitakers had become a symbol not just of inbreeding's horrors, but of a nation's failure to confront its own shadows. The genetic consequences were now undeniable, etched into the very bodies of the family. Siblings like Larry, with his fused eyelids, and Ray, with his wordless cries, were living proof of what happens when bloodlines loop too tightly. Geneticists studying cases like the Whitakers describe a phenomenon called inbreeding depression, where recessive genes pile up, manifesting as physical and mental frailties. The family's medical records, though patchy, note conditions like epilepsy and severe developmental delays, some so profound that basic communication was a struggle. Yet, in rare moments captured by outsiders, there was a flicker of joy, a shared cigarette, a laugh over a shared memory, that reminded the world these were people, not just a case study. The darker truths, though, refused to stay buried. Whispers of abuse persisted, with allegations surfacing as late as the 2000s. One chilling account, tucked away in a local newspaper archive, spoke of a young Whitaker girl barely into her teens, pregnant under circumstances that pointed to a relative. The case echoed earlier tragedies, a grim reminder that the family's isolation didn't just preserve their bloodline, it enabled cycles of harm. Legal interventions came and went, but the Whitakers' insularity made change nearly impossible. Betty's fierce protectiveness, while admirable, often shielded the guilty as much as the innocent, perpetuating a legacy of silence. This story's power lies in its ability to unsettle, to force us to look at the edges of society where help rarely reaches. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were a warning, a mirror reflecting the cost of neglect, poverty, and ignorance. Their lives, shaped by choices made generations ago, ask us to consider what we owe those trapped in cycles not of their making. As we near the end of this tale, the question looms, can a bloodline so broken ever find redemption? Or is it doomed to echo its own tragedies forever? The Whitaker family story, as it stands today, is a haunting echo that refuses to fade, carried forward by the few who remain in odd, West Virginia. The shacks, now barely standing, are like bones of a past that clings to the present. Betty, the unwavering matriarch, has grown frail, her life spent holding together a family fractured by its own blood. Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, among the last of their generation, live in a world that's both timeless and trapped, surrounded by the same hills that cradled their ancestors' sins. The internet has made them infamous, their faces splashed across screens, dissected by strangers who see them as a spectacle rather than a tragedy. Yet in their daily lives, there's a quiet defiance, a refusal to be defined solely by their pain. The genetic legacy of the Whitakers is a textbook case of inbreeding's long shadow. Scientists point to their story as a stark illustration of how isolated communities, cut off from resources, can spiral into biological ruin. Conditions like congenital heart defects, cleft palates, and profound developmental delays aren't just medical notes. They're the visible scars of a bloodline that looped too tightly for too long. The family's isolation, once a shield against a judgmental world, became a prison, locking them into cycles of poverty and dysfunction. And yet, there's a flicker of humanity that endures, moments of tenderness, like Betty's fierce care for her siblings, or Timmy's childlike smile, that remind us these are people, not just a cautionary tale. The darker threads of their story, allegations of abuse, of children born to children, persist in the collective memory of Odd. Court records, though sparse, hint at incidents as recent as the 2010s, where the family's insularity allowed harm to fester unchecked. These aren't just stories of the past. They are wounds that never fully healed, passed down like an inheritance no one wanted. The community, complicit in its silence, shares the blame, as does a society that left rural Appalachia to fend for itself. The Whitaker's tale forces us to ask, how many other families, hidden in America's forgotten corners, are trapped in similar cycles, unseen and unaided? This story doesn't end with answers, but with questions that linger like mist in the hollows. What does it mean to be human when your bloodline betrays you? What does it say about a nation that lets its tunnels of despair widen generation after generation? The Whitakers, living relics of a buried truth, challenge us to confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. Their story, raw and unsettling, is a mirror held up to America's past, a past that still whispers in the hills of West Virginia, waiting for those brave enough to listen. You've journeyed with us through the Whitaker family's haunting tale, peeling back layers of a bloodline twisted by time and circumstance. Their story, buried in the hollows of Odd, West Virginia, isn't just a family's tragedy. It's a mirror to America's forgotten corners, where poverty and isolation breed secrets too heavy to carry. The shacks still stand, crumbling sentinels of a past that clings to the present, whispering of children born too soon, of lives warped by choices made generations ago. Betty's unwavering loyalty, Ray's wordless cries, and the chilling accounts of girls as young as 12 bearing the weight of their kin's sins, these are the threads of a tapestry no one was meant to see. This isn't a story that ends neatly, tied up with answers or redemption. The Whitakers live on, their lives a quiet defiance against a world that both shuns and exploits them. Their bloodline, scarred by inbreeding, carries the weight of congenital defects, heart issues, cleft palates, minds locked in eternal childhood. Yet in their laughter, their shared moments of tenderness, there's a humanity that refuses to be erased. The allegations of abuse, documented through decades in court records, point to a darker truth: isolation doesn't just preserve, it destroys, enabling cycles of harm that no one fully stopped. The girl pregnant at 12 wasn't just a victim of her family. She was a casualty of a society that looked away. What does this tale ask of us? To confront the shadows we'd rather ignore. To question what we owe those trapped in cycles of despair. The Whitakers aren't just a family. They're a warning etched in flesh and bone, a reminder that neglect festers where help doesn't reach. Appalachia's hills hold countless stories like theirs, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. As you leave this story, carry its weight with you. Ask yourself, what happens when a nation forgets its own? What other truths lie buried, waiting to be unearthed? Before you go, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment. Tell us what this tale stirred in you and where you're watching from. The Whitaker family's echoes linger, and so do the questions they leave behind. Until next time, keep searching for the truths hidden in the shadows.